Good afternoon and welcome to the second of the Lyman Beecher Lectures in Preaching. I am Nora Tubbs-Tisdale. I am a brand new faculty member here in the field of preaching, delighted to join this faculty this fall. And it is my great privilege this afternoon to get to introduce Tom Long. There are those introductions you get to do in life that are a true privilege. This is one of them. I have known our Lyman Beecher lecturer, I was counting up last night, for 22 years. And through those years, I have known him as teacher, as mentor, as faculty colleague, and he and his wife Kim are very dear friends. I first met Tom Long back in the mid-1980s. At the time, I was just finishing up my first pastorate, serving for 5 years as pastor with my husband Al of 4 small churches in Central Virginia. And I was contemplating doing PhD studies in preaching and trying to figure out where I could go to do that. One summer, we went to a conference at Massanutten Springs, Virginia, and the keynote preacher and speaker was none other than Tom Long. We heard him preach that morning. I went to a workshop he did on preaching that afternoon. I can still remember clearly going back to our room and saying to my husband, I found the person who can teach me everything I want to know about preaching. But there is one problem. He has just gone to join the faculty of Princeton Theological Seminary, and we have just moved to Richmond, Virginia. What am I going to do? Well, to make a long story short, I ended up commuting from Richmond, Virginia to Princeton, New Jersey, when I had a pastor's spouse, which I still have, the same one, and 2 small children who are none the worse for the wear for that, I am happy to report, to study preaching with Tom Long. Family-wise, we don't want to relive those 2 years. People think we've done crazy things in later life. They don't know nothing. But in terms of a person who loved preaching, who was excited about preaching, they were wonderful, wonderful, heady, exciting years. I still remember sitting in a PhD seminar in contemporary homiletical theory with Tom Long and reading many of the books that were written by prior Beecher lecturers here at Yale Divinity School. I left Princeton, went to teach at Union Theological Seminary in Virginia for 5 years, and then came back to be Tom Long's colleague on the faculty at Princeton. I have admired many things about him, and one of them is the energy of this man who not only keeps up a steady schedule of preaching and lecturing at events like this around the country, but who has also managed to publish some 16 books in his career, including a recent re-edition of his now classic textbook in preaching called The Witness of Preaching, which we use here in our homiletics courses at Yale Divinity School. To the field of homiletics, Tom Long, as you've already seen in his first lecture, brings a scholar's passion for new learning, a pastor's love for the church and its preaching ministry, an orator's gift for highly imaginative and metaphorical prose, and a teacher's ability to inspire, to encourage, to challenge. I eagerly look forward with you to hearing his second lecture that he will bring us today, entitled, No News is Bad News, The Presence of the Word in Preaching. And I have a feeling that one day, perhaps at the dawn of the next century, the 22nd century, students will be sitting around a homiletical classroom in homiletical theory, reading the Beecher lectures from back in '06 that were given by none other than Thomas G. Long. Will you join me in welcoming?
Yes, they're going to appreciate me when I'm dead. Thank you, Nora. It's so great to see you on this faculty. One of the most fascinating and certainly one of the most hotly debated moments in church history concerns the day that a young Martin Luther celebrated his first Mass as a newly ordained priest. As Luther biographer John Todd describes it, Luther's Mass was exceptionally momentous for him, and getting ready for it was something like preparing for a wedding. On the one hand, Luther approached his first Mass quite reverently. He was profoundly aware of his identity as a priest and the sacred and worshipful side of this great event. He was determined to remain focused on his liturgical task and detached from all worldly distractions. On the other hand, there were a lot of worldly distractions. In those days, a new priest's first Mass was a highly public spectacle, a kind of blend of a graduation party, a nuptial feast, and a debutante ball wrapped into one. There were bright torches and gala meals and a gaggle of well-wishers and friends and family all present to celebrate Martin's debut, including Luther's brooding father, Hans, who was still grumpy, resentful, and angry that Martin had defied his wishes and become a priest. As the high moment approached, the 23-year-old Luther was as nervous as a groom. And unfortunately, as Todd observes, the day itself proved to be, if not exactly a disaster, a day that Luther could never remember without quaking the rest of his life. What happened? Well, like most beginning clergy, Luther was terrified that he would commit a blunder at the altar, that he was going to spill the wine or drop the host or stumble over a prayer. He didn't do any of those things. But what did happen is that he had what we might call a momentary but fairly severe panic attack, a seizure of paralysis and terror. It came, interestingly enough, as he raised his voice to say the great prayer in the canon of the Mass, that long narrative recital that includes the consecration of the elements. He was standing at the high altar and he began to intone the prayer. Therefore, O most merciful Father, and then it happened. As Todd describes it, suddenly he was overtaken in a flash by an instant identity crisis. How dare he? How could he actually speak to God? The whole thing was unthinkable. He felt obliterated in the face of the assumption that he was to address God. For a moment, he made as if he was going to leave the altar, and he said something to the prior who had been stationed there for just such an emergency. The prior smiled at him, pushed him back to the altar, and suddenly it was over. Out in the nave of the church, they probably noticed nothing. The priest had his back to the congregation, and he had to move about anyway. And Luther continued the Mass, sweating and shaken, but safely couched again in the routine of the liturgy. What happened there? Well, Luther himself described this meltdown in dramatic theological terms. Kierkegaard once remarked that Luther always spoke and acted as if lightning were about to strike behind him the next minute. And sure enough, Luther's later description of what happened to him that day is powerful and electrically charged. When he started into the prayer, he said, I was utterly stupefied and terror-struck. I thought to myself, with what tongue shall I address such majesty? I'm dust and ashes, and I am speaking to the living and eternal and true God. However, Erik Erikson, as you may know, has famously doubted that it was only Luther's awareness of the majesty of God that turned him into jelly that day, but it was also his deeply neurotic psyche. Erikson envisions Luther standing there facing the high altar with his back to the congregation as a fragile wisp caught between the two pincers of powerful and frowning fathers, divine and earthly, God the Father and Hans the Father. In front of him, said Erikson, was the Eucharist's uncertain grace Behind him, his Father's potential wrath, the overwhelming and mystic presence of the sacrament combined with an infantile struggle over obedience and identification with Father to reduce Luther to a shaking mass of speechless fear. Now, to tell you the truth, as a child of our time and culture, and as one who has myself felt in leading worship the paralyzing fear of stage fright and the sweaty aftershocks of God knows what subterranean psychic earthquakes, I find Erickson's psychosocial explanation somehow more plausible than Luther's spiritual one. And the fact that I do, and maybe you do too, is interesting and revealing, isn't it? There's something about me anyway, something about us perhaps, something about our time to be sure, that can more easily imagine ourselves being awestruck by psychic trauma than by a theophany, more quickly reduced to quivering by our unconscious than by our Creator, more readily crumpled to the floor in paralyzed awe by anal regression than the presence of the Mysterium Tremendum. Years ago, when I was a seminary student, I served as a pastoral intern one summer in a congregation in the Carolinas. My supervising pastor asked me to provide pastoral care to several families in the congregation. One of these families was a rather large family with a large number of children, the youngest of whom, a boy named John, had cerebral palsy. Whenever I would visit this family, I would find them, for example, seated at the dinner table, engaged in lively discussion, telling jokes, exchanging stories. It was as if they were bathed in a circle of light, except for John, who stood literally and figuratively outside of the circle of light, watching them. One afternoon, I went to visit this family, and only John's mother was at home. We sat in the living room and we chatted about this and that, and then she wanted to tell me about an experience that she had had in that very room just a few days before. She said it was late in the afternoon and she was in the room and she was reading or knitting, I can't remember which now, and as she did, John stood at the end of the hallway in the shadows watching her. She said she felt a shift in the room and she looked up. And what she said was, I saw Jesus with his arm around John. I looked away and I looked back, and there was only John. But for the first time since he was born, I saw John as already healed in the power of God. Now, I don't know what happened there, but I do know the two different things that we did with it. As for her, she turned that visionary experience into ethics. She started in that community programs for disabled children in the community and in the school that are still in place to this day. That's what she did with it. I had just had a quarter of CPE. And what I did with it was to psychoanalyze what happened, fortunately silently to myself. She's feeling so guilty about this child, I said, that she has projected her failure through the symbol system of the Christian faith. In other words, I took an experience that she felt it necessary to describe in theological language. I reduced it to psychology so that I could move it around on the chessboard of manageability. And if her minister does that, think what her culture does. Sociologist of religion Peter Berger has described how the very conditions of scientific technological society, even when that society officially and publicly celebrates religion, nonetheless subtly pressure people to soft pedal, if not to abandon altogether, the genuinely transcendent dimensions of their own religious experience. Berger says there are two possibilities. Either people don't have experiences of God as much as they used to, or they have experiences of God just as often as they ever did, but they hide them or deny them because of the delegitimation of the experience by the prevailing worldview, and they sometimes hide them even to themselves. Every religious experience needs multiple languages to describe it. I'm not dismissing the language of psychology. But in our culture, those languages often compete with each other rather than cooperate until the language of transcendence is pinned and loses its capacity to speak at all and is replaced by the proximate and more reasonable explanations. Now, to get to the point, I sometimes wonder if we who preach, who have so many languages to explain what we are doing, we're giving people inspiration, we're building up churches, we're serving as social critics, we're providing positive role models, if we've lost a sense of the theological reality that almost sent Luther fleeing from the chancel. Do you remember that great moment when Frederick Douglass was addressing a Boston audience about racism in America, and Sojourner Truth was there in the auditorium, sitting tall and attentive on the very first row, facing the platform? As he spoke, Douglass grew more and more agitated, more and more despairing, saying finally, "There's no hope for justice outside of violence and bloodshed," and he sat down, and the hall fell into a tense hush. Then, in her deep and commanding voice, Sojourner Truth spoke a sentence heard all over the room. "Frederick, is God dead?" Whenever I tune into the overly upbeat television preachers, or closer to home, run into the casual, chatty preachers of the relaxed suburban congregation, welcoming people with the perkiness of Katie Couric and running through the joys and concerns as if they were recreation directors on cruise ships, I remember what Karl Barth said about preaching to a gathering of ministers one summer day many years ago, and the wind ruffles through my hair again. He was talking about what he called the great peril of preaching, and he said, "What are you doing, you human being, with the word of God on your lips? Upon what grounds do you assume the role of mediator between heaven and earth? Who has authorized you to take your place there and generate religious feeling? Is not the whole situation in the church an illustration of humanity's chronic presumption? Can a minister be saved?" I would answer, with humans it's impossible. But with God, all things are possible. God may pluck us as a brand out of the fire, but so far as we know, there is no one who deserves the wrath of God more abundantly than the ministers. There's a story told about an old Welsh pastor who preached every Sunday in a room like this, but with a spiral staircase leading up to a tall pulpit. And every Sunday he would climb slowly up that staircase and preach. One Sunday he made it halfway up the spiral staircase and stopped and said, "I will not go into that awful place." But then his vocation won over his fear. He put one foot in front of the other and climbed up and preached. Now look, I don't have any interest in increasing the anxiety of preaching. It's high enough as it is. I would be dismayed if every Sunday I had to wrestle with a Luther-style panic attack, or stood in the pulpit with Bardian abject humiliation, or wondered if lightning were about to strike behind me at any moment. But what I find exhilarating in Luther and Barth and Sojourner Truth and others like it is the profound and body-tingling awareness that we are finally not left to our own devices, that there is something powerful and holy that just might happen in the event of preaching. There's a beautiful scene in Garrett Kaiser's A Dresser of Sycamore Trees. Kaiser's a minister in Vermont, and he tells of conducting a Saturday night Easter vigil service in his little church. This is the first time, as far as he can remember, that this parish has observed the Saturday vigil, and only two other people, a husband and a wife, have shown up for the service. Kaiser lights the Paschal candle, and he begins the liturgy. Dear friends in Christ, on this most holy night in which our Lord Jesus passed over from death to life, the church invites her members dispersed throughout the world to gather in vigil and prayer, he began. The candle sputtered in the half-darkness, he wrote, like a voice too embarrassed or overwhelmed to proclaim the news that Christ is risen. But it catches fire, and there we are, 3 people and a flickering light in an old church on a Saturday evening in the spring with the noise of the cars and their winter-rusted mufflers outside. The moment is filled with the ambiguities of all such quiet observances among few people in the midst of an oblivious population in a radically secular age. The act is so ambiguous because its terms are so extreme. The Lord is with us, or we are pathetic fools. I like it that way, he says. I believe God likes it that way, and my worry is always that others will be discouraged rather than exalted by the omnipresence of the 2 possibilities. The Lord is with us, or we are pathetic fools. I like it that way too. To put it in preaching terms, either God is present and active in our preaching, or we are posers and pathetic fools. Either we preachers are fools for Christ or just damn fools. 2 awesome and awe-filled possibilities. And we just have to take the risk. I am not engaging in a rhetorical ploy here. If we do not seriously raise the possibility and run the risk of just being damn fools in the pulpit, then we'll never get near the possibility of being a fool for Christ. I would suggest that many preachers today, however, have shied away from these 2 terrifying possibilities and retreated to a much safer option. Much of the preaching in our time in the American pulpit has taken on the posture of wisdom literature. Take a romp through the thousands of church websites on the internet, sample a sermon here and there, and what one finds going on in the pulpits across the land, or at least in pulpits in churches wealthy enough to have websites, is an abundance of sage advice. There's sermon wisdom about parenting, and wisdom about finding purpose in one's work and relationships, and wisdom about engaging in the struggle for justice, and wisdom about being more caring toward others, and wisdom about accepting differences and being more inclusive, and wisdom about doctrinal truth and biblical texts and nurturing one's spiritual life. And God knows we need wisdom. There's nothing wrong with the wisdom genre, and much of the pulpit wisdom is sound and mostly Christian, I suppose. But it often has the sickly, sweet aroma of smoldering incense in a temple where the deity has long since departed. It often has the sound of the hollow and lonely wisdom of Job's friends, who can quote the Psalms and the Proverbs, but have ceased to expect the whirlwind. It's what's left when the possibility of holy encounter has been eliminated, and all that remains is how to use religion to manage and cope with our lives. As for being good news, many of these sermons are good, but there's no news. Nothing's happening. No event of God, and when it comes to the gospel, no news is bad news. Sermons, ironically, in which God, as Frederick Buechner once observed, is the most missed of all missing persons. By contrast, the Jesuit William Harmless, in his book Augustine and the Catechumenate, has taken us inside the basilica in the ancient North African town of Hippo to recreate the excitement and eventfulness of the services where Augustine was the preacher. As Harmless describes these services, they crackled with energy and expectation and presence. In Augustine's mouth, the word was not merely being taught. In the power of the Spirit, it was flashing in an electric blue arc across the assembly. Augustine preached at least 4 times every week, sometimes every day, and the room was crowded with townspeople standing shoulder to shoulder, artisans, fishermen, merchants, magistrates, the baptized learners, curious pagans, Jews, Donatists, Manichees, crowding in to hear the magnetic and engaging preacher. But what they heard, Augustine insisted always, was not a celebrated orator, but the Word, in a chorus of voices, the Word from the cantor, from the reader, from the preacher. In the cries of the assembly, they heard the Word sung and cheered and preached and prayed. God speaks, said Augustine, of the whole worship. All of this is the voice of God echoing throughout the round world. Now, admittedly, Augustine, his contemporary said, was a born preacher and a dazzling orator. Even his harshest critics had to admire his ability to fashion cathedrals out of words. One of Harry Emerson Fosdick's detractors, by the way, once said, "That man says what I don't believe better than anybody I have ever heard." So it was. So it was with Augustine. For example, Secundicus, one of his critics, a Manichae, once quipped about Augustine, "I've never been able to discern a Christian in him, but a god of eloquence, always." Part of his effectiveness came in the strength of his thought and the simple elegance of his language. He never resorted to the language of the street. Peter Brown notes, he always used the refined Latin of the educated elite, but he pared it down to an accessible simplicity so that what sounded like a superbly unaffected Christian style was actually a simplicity achieved on the other side of sophistication. But his words and ideas alone did not account for the power of his sermons. One of his friends once remarked, "Oh, his writings have been very popular, but you ought to hear him preach." No one could be passive when listening to one of Augustine's sermons, and church-going in Hippo, Harmless said, was a raucous, noisy affair. The congregation applauded, shouted, cried out. Once in the sermon, almost offhandedly, Augustine described a man who was traveling to a foreign land to get married, but who encountered a roaring lion on the way and strangled it. The congregation responded, "Samson, Samson, Samson." Sometimes when he headed off toward a favorite preaching theme, the hearers would guess where he was going and encourage him with shouts of anticipation. Or if he chastised them, they would groan loudly and beat their breast. Sometimes they applauded his musical turns of phrase, much as we might applaud a jazz clarinetist improvisational flurries. It was North African early call and response, was what it was. Listen to this paragraph from one of his sermons. As he spoke these words, waves broke across the assembly and the hearers began to cheer. Listen to this. "Loved is the world, but let your love prefer the one by whom the world was made. Vast is the world, but more vast is the one by whom the world was made. Beautiful is the world, but more beautiful is the one by whom the world was made. Alluring is the world, but more alluring the one by whom the world was made." By the time he spoke that last line, the cheering was so loud, he stopped the sermon in surprise. "What have I said?" he said to the congregation. "What's there to cheer about? We're still battling the problem. You've already started to cheer." The point here is something was happening in the event of the sermon. It wasn't just reflective wisdom, not just good oratory. This is language summoned and swept into the event of God speaking and acting. "Why do I preach?" he said. "Why do I sit up here? What do I live for? For this one thing alone, that together we may live with Christ. This is my passion. This is my honor. This is my fame. This is my joy." So while I don't want to freeze and panic at the altar, I would like preaching today, preaching in general, my preaching in particular, maybe yours, to gain a deeper participation in the eventfulness of God. What's it going to take? Several things. First of all, I think it's going to involve a kind of humility on the part of the preacher to get out of the way of the event of God. I had a friend who was at worship one Sunday morning, and during the service he happened to notice an old friend of his on the other end of the pew he had not seen for a long time. And so when the service was over, instead of leaving, he slid down the pew and engaged his friend in conversation. The sanctuary emptied of people except for these two old friends and a few children who were running around, as children are wont to do. One of the children, a little boy, went up into the pulpit area. The microphone was still on. He saw his mother in the back of the church, and so he said, "Mommy, Mommy, look at me, look at me." And my friend's friend said, "I think I've heard that sermon before." I heard you preach it. And then I stole it and preached it myself. Another part of this will involve recovering a confidence in the capacity of language to be a carrier-way for divine encounter, or perhaps better said, to trust that God in God's freedom will choose to be present in our little words. Literary critic George Steiner, in his book Real Presences, notes the underlying skepticism about theological language in our culture, that when in our culture we speak of God, we're really speaking of God in the same way that we speak of sunrise or sunset. In other words, it's a dated piece of language, as if the Copernican model of the solar system had not already replaced erratically the Ptolemaic. Vacant metaphors, eroded figures of speech. This is why rational men and women, particularly in the scientific and technological realities of the West, still refer to God. It's a phantom of grammar, a fossil embedded in the childhood of rational speech. So Nietzsche and many after him. But Steiner says, I wish to argue the reverse. I propose that any coherent understanding of what language is and how language performs, any coherent capacity of human speech to communicate meaning and feeling is in the final analysis underwritten by the assumption of God's presence. Whenever we encounter in the other the condition of freedom, it is a wager on transcendence. I like that, a wager on transcendence. Frederick Buechner, you may remember, reminded us that the preacher deals out the sermon note cards like a riverboat gambler, and the stakes have never been higher. This is a wager on transcendence. In addition to a confidence in language as a medium for the holy, the regaining of a sense of the presence and action of God in preaching also involves, I think, the rethinking of a fairly routine, labor-intensive, and often neglected aspect of sermon preparation, namely the way we exegete and interpret biblical texts. Now, before I launch into this brief proposal on exegesis, let me hasten to say that I mean here to add to the preacher's repertoire of approaches to biblical interpretation, not to replace or narrow any of them. Preaching is odd business when you think about it. We stand up week after week in a highly visible place holding a several thousand-year-old text, and we commit acts of public hermeneutics. That takes nimbleness, imagination, courage, creativity, and every responsible method we can get our hands on. I will never forget, several years ago, reading with electricity running up and down my spine the explorations of biblical texts in the book Text and Texture by Rabbi Michael Fishbane, now professor of Jewish studies at the University of Chicago Divinity School. In this book, Fishbane does what he calls close readings of a couple of dozen biblical texts, and the results to me are stunning. Now, he has several methods, various methods. Sometimes he's a historical critic, sometimes he's a literary critic. Here, sociology, there, Jewish mysticism. But it's all seamless. You can't tell when he's moving from one method to another, and the text yield one moving insight after another. I was quite surprised, however, to read sometime later another biblical scholar's review of Fishbane's work. He placed Fishbane essentially as a literary critic, and then he sniffed. Fishbane does not propose any general critical method, and the book seems finally less concerned with poetics than with homiletics. It was not a compliment. What the critic meant was that Fishbane, for all of his skill, finally stained his methodological purity for the sake of the highly lamentable desire to say something from these texts that real human beings just might find meaningful. He was merely homiletical. It's true, of course, Fishbane uses many methods, not just one, and I think it's because the driving force from him is that finally he remembers that he is a rabbi. And he remembers that there are other rabbis who at the end of the day are facing congregations of people waiting for them who want to live their lives in the light of these great texts. Herb Gardner, the playwright, once confessed that his recurring anxiety dream, we all have one, his recurring anxiety dream is that he is writing the last act of a new play. But he is not quietly at his desk in the study. He's sitting at a folding table on the stage of the Booth Theater in New York, writing furiously. On the other side of the curtain, he can hear the opening night audience gathering. People are taking their seats, folding their playbills, coughing and chatting. In a few minutes, the curtain will rise, and the play is not finished. The play is not finished. Do I ever identify with that anxiety dream? It is Sunday morning, and I can hear the congregation gathering, coughing, folding their bulletins, and the sermon is not finished. In fact, I am locked in my study with a suddenly recalcitrant little text. At the beginning of the week, it seemed like such a sweet little text, all chatty. But now it has turned cold and surly on me. Will I use every method I know? You betcha. I will prize at it with the crowbar of historical criticism. I will entreat it with rhetorical categories in sociology and feminism and liberation thought. I will get down on my knees and beg, speak to me that I may speak. Because in a few minutes the curtain will rise and they will be out there. And in ways they sometimes don't even know, they will ask the question shouted by African American congregations, is there a word from the Lord? Forgive me then my methodological promiscuity. I am only a preacher, a beggar, and my needs are merely homiletic. So how can exegesis allow our preaching to be more open to the eventfulness of God? Nothing, of course, can make God perform in a text or a sermon. What we seek, rather, is a way of seeing and hearing what God is already doing. Several years ago, New Testament scholar Daniel Pott wrote a fascinating book called Preaching Paul. And what Pott was exploring was not how do you preach the Pauline epistles, but what can we learn about preaching in our day from Paul's own methodology in his day? Paul, Pott said, was actually in a situation a lot like our own. He had a gospel to preach that was couched in a vocabulary his people did not know, Jewish apocalyptic. He was preaching to people whose language and thought forms were shaped by a culture other than the gospel, Hellenism. So what should he do? Should he ask the Hellenists to learn Jewish apocalyptic concepts, risking befuddlement? Or should he maybe translate the Jewish apocalyptic concepts into Hellenistic categories, risking loss in the translation? Pott says Paul chose the third option. He held the Jewish apocalyptic gospel up to his eyes like a lens, and he looked through it. And when he looked through it, he could see cross-resurrection trajectories at work in the Hellenistic world of his hearers. And then using both their language and his, he told them about it. God is at work in your world. Do you see it? Do you see it? Preaching Paul's gospel, said Pott, is essentially the proclamation that the power of God for salvation is at work in our present tense. The power of God is not when we learn a general principle. It's when we are confronted by Christ-like manifestations of God at work in our midst. News, news, good news. Now, I think what Pott is doing here offers a hermeneutical option to us that is more complex and powerful than the customary attempt to find simple analogies in the text. This is our typical preacher's ploy. We try to find simple analogies in the text. We read a story of Jesus and then we tell the congregation, aren't we just like those Pharisees? Well, no. As a matter of fact, we aren't just like those Pharisees. And our connections to the text need to be more poetic and move beyond a one-to-one mechanical analogy. Now look, I can't stay with Pott alone. His rather strict structuralism, his mathematical ensemble of binary oppositions tends, I think, finally to restrict the scriptural range. Cross-resurrection is important. It's a macro symbol. But when you get closer to the grain, God is doing a lot of things. Blessing and judging, healing and guiding, lifting up the weak and bringing down the proud and the oppressor. We need a more complex set of lenses than just the one cross-resurrection lens. I think we get a wider range of possibilities in the narrative hermeneutics of Paul Ricoeur. In Time and Narrative, brilliantly, perhaps surprisingly, he sets Augustine and Aristotle in conversation with each other about time and plot, and there is an amazing payoff, I think, for biblical exegesis. There's a long argument to be made here. I cannot make it on this occasion, and so the brief version of it. When he turns to Augustine, he turns to that part of Augustine where Augustine is trying to understand time. I understand time, said Augustine, until you ask me about it, and then I don't understand it. Because it seems like it doesn't exist. The future is not there, it's only there in expectation. When something happens and becomes past, it's no longer there except in memory, and even the present keeps eroding out from under my feet. But finally, he said it's that sense of passing away. That's the quality of time that matters to us. It's like the sounding of a gong. Boom. We can feel it passing away. There are only three kinds of time, he said, and they're all in the present. The present of past experience, the present of the present, and the present of future expectation, and it's unstable. Only eternity is stable. Our experience of time, unstable. So from Augustine, Ricoeur hears discordance in our lives, gaps, fragments. From Aristotle's Poetics, however, Ricoeur gets just the opposite. If for Augustine, human life and time is about time being shredded into discordance, for Aristotle, when plots and narratives and stories and myths are created, discordance is being shaped into concordance. How does an artist create concord out of discord? Through the process of mimesis, said Aristotle. Mimesis is the way a storyteller or a poet creatively imitates and synthesizes powerful and purposeful human action. Augustine is the way we live. Aristotle is how we make stories and meaning. So what happens when we put the two of them together? Well, here's where Ricoeur freely and brilliantly, I think, departs from Aristotle to describe three levels of mimesis, which he playfully calls mimesis 1, mimesis 2, and mimesis 3. Mimesis 1, well, that's what we're experiencing right here. And it's the closest to Augustine's discordance. Here we are in this room in the present tense. What's going on here? Our motives? Mixed. Our experiences? Fragmentary, gapped, mysterious. Even this present moment we're standing on is slipping out from under our feet right as we experience it. That sentence I just spoke is gone into a past, disappeared into nothingness. And yet, for all of this fragmentation and mystery, there is still the tacit sense in this room that what we are doing this afternoon is not absurd. We're living out of some meaningful narrative. All the ingredients are here. Human agency, purpose, relationships, it's all here, but its coherence is not yet visible to us. This is what Ricoeur calls prefiguration, mimesis 1. And then somebody steps in and introduces a text like this lecture. Narrative or narrative-like, it has a plot. It imitates, it organizes, it configures in a particular way. This is mimesis 2, configuration. Now, what happens to us when a text intrudes into our consciousness, when mimesis 1 gets invaded by mimesis 2? Well, Ricoeur is convinced, and he's been convinced about this all of his career, that when a text enters our scene, it projects a world in front of it and beckons us to participate in this world. This is quite controversial because what he is explaining and expecting and claiming is that texts reliably refer to realities outside themselves. There really is something outside the text, and it's a world projected in front of it. He argued that point with Levi-Strauss. He argued it with the structuralist. He argued it with Derrida. For me, he's right, but I guess you have to pay your money and take your choice. Mimesis 2 can't impose its world on Mimesis 1. It's not a template. It's an invitation. The reader has to read it, or the listener has to hear it. And when you do, you give and you take. You resist and you yield. You finally leave the world of the text and return to your own present tense, but potentially changed. The old world has been refigured, and this is mimesis 3. Prefiguration, textual configuration, a re-entry into the world as refiguration. Now, it sounds complicated, and it is, but Robert Wuthnow at Princeton has put some flesh on this in a study he did about how it is that people actually live out of narratives that change their ethical lives. Things happen to people, said Wuthnow, that become moral stories, and they live their lives differently on the basis of them. An example he gives is Jack Casey, who is an ambulance driver. He's a CPR kind of paramedic person. When Jack Casey was a little boy, he had some dental surgery which required anesthetic. And he was terrified on the operating table, and the operating room nurse did what she should not have done. She said to him, "Do not be afraid. I will not leave you. I'm staying right here." And she was good to her word. When he woke up in recovery, there she was. Years later, Casey is called to the scene of an accident on the highway. A pickup truck is overturned. Gasoline is dripping on the driver. They're using the jaws of life to get the driver out. One spark, and the driver's terrified, crying out that he's afraid to die. Jack Casey did what he should not have done. He crawled through the broken windshield of the pickup truck and nestled himself next to the driver and said, "Do not be afraid. I will not leave you. I'm staying right here." And he was good to his word. The next day he was visiting the driver in the hospital. The driver recognized him and said, "You're crazy as hell. We could have both been burned up out there. Why did you do that?" He said, I don't know. It just seemed like the thing to do." Prefiguration got lifted by a narrative into configuration, and it refigured his ethical life. Now, this gives us, if that brief summary makes any sense at all, a way of looking at biblical texts as having the power to configure and ultimately reconfigure people's ethical lives. When we look at them, not as simple analogies, but look through them to see, among other things, What is God doing as a trajectory across human life, and how may we point to that and proclaim it? Let me give you an example or two. Here's a text I've never preached on, and maybe you haven't either. It's Exodus 22, 26, and 7. If you take your neighbor's cloak in pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down. It may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover, and what else shall that person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. And that's a piece of casuistic law, case law. If this happens, then this is what you shall do. And if you're doing simple analogy, about the only sermon you could preach is one against pawnbrokering. But stay close to the text and alert to the action of God. And it sounds like this. If you take your neighbor's cloak in pawn, and notice where that places you. It places you right in the middle of the ordinary world of economic discourse, and it places you in a position of power. If you take your neighbor's cloak in pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down, says the voice, to which you should reply, hell no. Collateral does not work that way. You don't give it back before the sun goes down. You give it back only when the loan is repaid, to which the voice gives a rejoinder. It may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover, which you should say, exactly. That's why it works as collateral. It's valuable to my neighbor. To which the voice replies, well, in what else shall that person sleep? And you should respond, not my problem. To which the voice responds, well, then I'm making it my problem. If your neighbor cries out, I will listen, for I am compassionate. Wow, do you see what the text did? It took us from Walmart to theophany. That'll preach. Or take this text from Luke. I've never preached on this one either. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so too will it be in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating and drinking and marrying and being given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed all of them. Likewise, just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day that Lot left Sodom, it rained fire and sulfur from heaven and destroyed all of them. It will be like that on the day that the Son of Man is revealed. About all I can think to say about that is the day of the Son of Man is going to be a very bad day, and I can give you 2 Old Testament examples to back it up. Robert Tannehill, however, has tracked the language of this poetic text in search of evidence of the transcendent action, and it sounds different. Listen to it. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so too it will be in the day of the Son of Man. Eating, drinking, marrying, being given in marriage. Why am I saying it that way? Because I'm trying to replicate the sound in Greek. It's ascendaton, that is to say verbs without conjunctions, like I came, I saw, I conquered. And not only that, the verbs rhyme. Estheon, epainon, egamon. Listen to that? What were they doing? They were eating and drinking and yada, yada, yada. In the middle of the ordinary, boring, routine rhythms of a 2-martini lunch, the crisis came. Likewise, as it was in the days of Lot, eating and drinking, we've heard this list before, buying and selling and planting, and Lord knows the list is getting longer and wider and deeper, and it moves on, and we know that it's going to end with but we don't know when it's going to. Note the posture of the body. Leaning forward in the boring rhythms of life with expectancy for the advent of a God who will shake the foundations. Now that will preach. If we pay attention to the mimetic action of God in a biblical text, it will give us some news to proclaim. And it will bring us closer to that ancient preacher who wrote, "When I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom. My speech and proclamation were not with plausible words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might rest not on human wisdom, but on the power of God." News, good news.